Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. Today's episode is a conversation with the designer and researcher Emily Smith. I met Emily last month when she visited Baltimore to lead a workshop with Prem Krishnamurthy, a previous Scratching the Surface guest, for first-year graduate students here at MICA, where I just finished my MFA. Currently based in Berlin, Emily's work is a bit different than the other guests that I usually talk to, in that her work revolves around this idea of visual anthropology and deals a lot with research and education, and really sort of lives outside of the traditional designer-client relationship and the kind of traditional design profession. But I think this perspective actually really offers a lot to the design discourse, and she really brings some interesting new ways to talk about and think about the work that we do. In this conversation, Emily and I talk about her background and how she stumbled into design, what it means to be a visual anthropologist, the role of research and writing in the design process, and how designers can learn more about anthropology and incorporate it into their own practice. I really enjoyed this conversation. It really got me thinking about a lot of things in new ways. And I really like how Emily's ideas are very process driven. So even though we talk about theory and things like that, it's really rooted in how it affects the things that we make. And so I think that you'll also really enjoy and learn a lot from her insights. So let's get right into it. Here is my conversation with Emily Smith. And I think it would be helpful to start with just a little bit of your own background and kind of how you got interested in design, and then kind of what you're doing now to kind of set it up, and then we can start talking about some larger themes.
I think, my introduction to design was probably when I was in LA in the early 1990s, working in the music industry.
Okay.
For promotional, kind of like I worked for a promoter and production. And I was sort of the behind the scenes person who would put these concerts together.
Oh, yeah.
And it was all the Pearl Jam and the Jane's Addiction and the Nirvana and all of that kind of stuff. I was clueless. I didn't really know what it was, but somehow I was, peripherally, there was all this sort of pop culture stuff that was happening that was design related. And then shortly thereafter, I sort of did that watershed thing where you kind of close up shop. I don't want to live in a big city anymore. And I moved to the UP, to Michigan.
Okay.
And there I was involved in a community where I had a coffee house, I had a secondhand clothing store, I had a music venue with my partner at the time.
You would just start these things up?
We just started making things, and we had this big space. What else can we do? And this is mid-90s. And just because it had to be done, I started making posters for the concerts or for the festivals that I was organizing. I was dancing, and I would, I was teaching, and I would do performance things, and I would make the flyers for it. And that's where I started to, I was interested in the programs at first, and teaching myself the programs. And then I took a couple of classes at the university there to kind of learn it. And that was where I think the first time I set some text that, set this thing, and I set it, and I said, oh, that's so Bauhaus. And I was like, what's Bauhaus?
I love it.
And so that sort of sparked this thing in terms of typography.
Yeah.
That sort of sent me into I was older, I was in my late 20s by then. I wanted to know more, and I wanted to figure that out. I wanted to. It felt like I suddenly stumbled upon something that could put my thoughts into form.
Yep. Yeah.
But it was a real stumble in a way. I had all this experience as a choreographer, and so I knew how to do that with movement. The idea that you have quality of movement, or you have space, and you have this language that you develop through the body and through movement and sound, and you put this into the choreography. But you can't make a living doing that. And I was at the age where I was like, okay, I need to make a living. And
right.
suddenly it seemed like this thing called, graphic design would start to give me
That's so
like
interesting.
skills, but it also felt like it was about, I was like, it feels like, it felt like choreography to me.
Graphic design.
Graphic designed it, the little pieces of it.
Yeah.
But also the larger picture of it. The ability to make something very, very clear and structured and legible, but also to be very associative and poetic and kind of put two things together that don't make sense. I didn't come to that. I didn't come to that thing until maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Oh,
but
interesting.
At the moment, it was more like I just shifted and I was attracted to this thing, so I just did it. But I thought I was leaving one thing completely behind.
And so how did you start to do that, or how did you kind of dive into that then?
The design part?
Yeah.
I decided to leave the Upper Peninsula and go back to Los Angeles, and I looked at, this is sort of the story of my life. Oh, what could I do? CalArts, Art Center.
Right.
Let's see where I get into. And I got into Art Center, and I didn't get into CalArts, and so that's where I ended up.
Okay.
I was like totally waitlisted, and they later on told me, we weren't sure if you should have been here.
Did you have like a portfolio, or like how did you apply?
The portfolio was all of the like
the posters and stuff
that I had been making. I think the only reason why Art Center had a second look was maybe that I was articulate in the way I wrote about things, that I actually probably my captions in my portfolio were smart, or that I had this other experience in sort of political and Latin American, sort of studies. I have a bachelor's degree in liberal arts.
I was just going to ask kind of, what were the things before that? Because you've now mentioned dance.
Yeah.
You seem like you were a good writer.
So we'll go back.
Just to kind of I just want to frame it a little bit. Yeah.
I have a degree in Latin American studies, and that's where I started really getting involved in dance.
Okay.
And that was research, and that was writing, and it was bachelor level theory. But once I finished that, and I kind of landed in Los Angeles, like I didn't really see where that was going to take me further. So I think probably Art Center saw that I had taken these different routes, that I was obviously smart. Mm-hmm. That I had a creative understanding in terms of choreography and dance. Yeah. That I had organized things, that I had some sort of administrative, facilitating kind of quality. I don't think they were particularly impressed with my design skills. Okay.
Were you thinking at all about kind of making a career out of this, or what were you thinking was?
It's a good question. At that time, it was sort of the beginning of the internet. So, So we're talking about 90, 98, 99, 2000. And I embraced, it was before human-centered design and really interface. Right. But it was more, I was kind of interested in creating platforms, this sounds so cliche now, that would bring people together through creative output. So it was like a group of teenage girls could post things they were working on, and somehow it would self-regulate, and they would have this ability to have sort of a social safe space to create teenage stuff. And it raised questions of censorship, or it raised questions of could an algorithm sort of somehow facilitate that space. And this is before Friendster, before Flickr, before Facebook, whatever. Now,
it's interesting.
But I also tend to have a short attention span. So then the next sort of series of projects would sort of jump into other kinds of things. I never really took to the programming side of a lot of that, but I think I still really like this idea of systems and algorithms and creating things that somehow spit out a result. Yeah. But that is totally related to me. That's the dance. That's the improvisational score.
Okay, like making some sort of framework that then you can kind of
play
around.
The improvisational score is choose 3 things, create a series of movements, and then roll the dice, and they randomly will come together, and that is the material you need to work with.
Interesting.
And it was the same thing. I like the idea of, like I created games where you had to, like I Ching, John Cage-esque, put, it's sort of chance, make this thing happen, and then deal with the consequences and make something out of it. Which doesn't have a lot of, at the time, didn't have a lot of real world application.
Was it, I'm curious about whether the work you were doing was kind of coming from this liberal arts background, was making this graphic design work, even if the stuff you were making wasn't kind of commercially viable or something that would get you a job at, like a, kind of traditional branding agency or something, was it intellectually stimulating to you at the time? Okay.
I had a really alternative education growing up.
Okay.
I think sort of Black Mountain-esque
style
elementary school in a way.
That already explains so much.
So I was much more comfortable with that interdisciplinary kind of conjunction, like juxtaposition of things that somehow relate to each other. I mean, that feels much more comfortable to me than trying to draw. Like I'm very suspect of these like sort of linear narratives that are really clean and sort of drive in a specific direction and end nicely.
Right.
That's always been somewhat hard for me to do. And I think maybe had I landed in, I'm trying to think, like had I landed in architecture, or had I landed in product, or had I landed in somehow like in art, like I think probably those things would have been the same strain, but there was something, design had enough constraints or enough expectations about what it is historically. I mean, this is the 90s still, so it's like, okay, there's postmodernism, deconstruction, and that just was sort of taking hold.
Yeah.
So you kind of could do these things, and you didn't have to worry about it too much. Like the concept of branding wasn't really set in stone at that point.
Right.
You were looking for sort of a unique form.
Yeah.
You were looking for something that looked different.
Right.
And then how did that communicate? You made it and then you analyzed it.
So how did you end up in Berlin? You're in Berlin now.
Yeah.
What happened kind of after LA? Yeah. Was that right to Berlin, or how did you end up there, and what were you?
I graduated in the end of 2000, and then I immediately went to Berlin.
Okay.
And I actually interviewed in LA. I remember interviewing in New York and in London, because that's what everybody did. That's what you were supposed to do. You had to particularly I think New York and London, and I did that, and then I stopped over in Berlin, and immediately I was like, oh, I think I'll just stay here.
Okay,
and
great.
It literally was like, maybe I'll find, like the whole job thing kind of was like, well, maybe I'll find something, and it was more like, I'd like to actually just live here. Talk about short attention span.
Right.
Okay, I finished my degree, I need to do this thing, but as soon as an opportunity was sort of presented that maybe you don't have to do this thing within the format that it's expected. I didn't speak German.
Okay.
And I landed, fortunately through my application landed on the desk of Prem Krishnamurthy, who liked something that I did related to Italo Calvino, and even though I didn't speak German, and it was an agency that was, you needed to have some German, he convinced them to hire me. And having said previously, I will not work in these fields, I worked on corporate branding for 4 years for a pharmaceutical company.
Okay.
Which to me was a really I suddenly did exactly what I was terrified to do, or avoided doing. In an interesting way, it was the right step because it grounded my practice. I had to kind of fully finish the circle. I had to really think about the precision or the concise nature of an idea to talk to a client about it. And I somehow kind of got tapped into this particular, it was an entire rebranding of a very large pharmaceutical company, and they were really open. I mean, what we made was not that special. It was really not that special.
Yeah.
But I had never really done, full on, corporate guidelines. And there I did an entire corporate guideline down to the minutest detail. And I benefited greatly from having had to do that.
Yeah.
Needless to say, I have not really done it since.
Yeah.
But there was something in that absolute perfection. I mean, that was a part of, like, that was then my portfolio went from being like bad posters to then, being this cool Italo Calvino to being, like IUD packaging, like guidelines, which is a kind of a strange circle. And that company kind of dissolved. And then out of that, I somehow again stumbled into a friend that was doing exhibition design.
Okay.
And so that actually ended up being the core of my professional work. If you were to ask me what kind of designer I am, I'm an exhibition designer.
Okay.
So we're landing at something that I didn't, I stumbled into again.
Right.
And it was at a time period in Berlin where all of the major museums, and we're not talking art museums, it was like the Natural History Museum, the Technical Museum, Historical Museum, that these museums had, after the fall of the wall, hadn't really had a redesign.
Yeah.
And so I got to be involved at sort of the ground level, a number of museums. And there was the introduction of where suddenly I didn't have a client. I had people who were experts. I had like 20 paleontologists who were essentially explaining things to me, and we had to figure out how to make it into a form.
Yeah.
Together with an architect, together with a media designer. And that, that became, that locked it in for me. Like, then it all, like, everything started to make sense.
So is that, I don't want to rush your story if unintentionally, but I'm curious, that now is starting to make sense in relation to what I understand of the work that you're doing now, kind of in the research and kind of anthropology side. Is that correct?
Yes.
So how do you, I have a series of questions around this that I'm going to ask you kind of at once, and then you can kind of pull them out and answer them however you want. But I'm curious kind of how you describe what you do, or what you introduce yourself and you say kind of what your job is. What is that thing that you say? And then the kind of second part of the question is, how does your work manifest itself now, kind of in comparison to being a kind of traditional practicing graphic designer?
I am no longer a traditional practicing graphic designer.
Okay.
I mean, that's actually really clear. At the end of the 2000s, the early, like maybe 2010, 2012, is where I kind of said I'm a little bit, like, I'm not really that interested in making of design.
Yeah.
I'm starting to change my mind, and I need to figure out the new format.
Yeah.
I am now an educator. Like, I'm a professor. I do a lot of research. I do a lot of, like, I teach in visual anthropology contexts. I teach in design contexts. I teach in, architecture contexts or in curatorial contexts. And I tend to either look at this overlap between the design process and methods and ethnographic methodology. And I'm looking at how those things overlap. We just jumped. How did I get there?
Yeah, I have a couple. One, how did you kind of arrive at that? And then...
Again, I'm a stumbler. I simply stumbled. I said, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. This design thing, this freelance design thing, where I am working with, really interesting people, and I am translating it and putting into this thing. Like I just kind of reached a point where I was actually tired of being a freelancer.
Okay.
Those kinds of jobs were also drying up because there was, Berlin is poor but sexy.
Okay.
I was getting older, and so I literally Googled Masters Berlin in English to figure out what kind of masters could one do in English. And there was one about art and context, which I think was an interesting and could have been an interesting approach. And then the other one was this visual and media anthropology.
Okay.
And I did not know what anthropology was. And the deadline had been postponed because there was a volcano in Iceland that stopped all air traffic. And so they basically, it was, applications were supposed to be due on Friday, but you were given an extra week. And I was like, oh, that's like in 2 days. And so I, again, Googled what is this thing.
Okay.
And again, I was waitlisted. And again, sort of they said, you were really interesting. We mostly look at people who have an anthropology background, or we look at people who are visual practitioners, meaning working within film or photography or journalism.
Okay.
We've never had a designer before. Somebody dropped out. I got the place. It was perfect. It was absolutely the best choice I could have made to add to what I do.
Yeah.
And that then at that moment in that master's program, everything came together. Suddenly, dance and choreography and improvisation makes sense in this qualitative social science. Film theory, photo history, media studies, in relationship to something that is sort of traditionally documentary, but then I could just insert design as that. Like, okay, what if we talk about type? What if we, instead of talk about the photograph, we're talking about layout, or we're talking about the book, or we're talking about display and the relationship between text and image. And suddenly all these things that I had been doing, same with what's the difference between facilitation and cooperation and collaboration? Huge discussion in anthropology on this topic, and that was like I ate that up. All these little pockets of what I think I was interested came together in that field.
So I have 2 questions, and these are going to sound very, very basic questions, but I just want to kind of like set the stage for kind of this next couple things. So I'm curious, one, just I'm embarrassed to kind of even ask this, but how would you describe or define visual anthropology? And then the second part is what were you actually doing in your classes in this program, or what did all of that involve then?
Okay, it's not a stupid question.
Okay.
Most anthropologists don't know what visual anthropology is. So anthropology in and of itself is the study of mankind. Where sociology looks at society, anthropology looks at the single human experience in relationship to culture.
Okay.
And normally you have ethnographic practice, which is embodied and embedded. You go and it's participant observation, and you spend a lot of time. You learn the language. You write. It's a lot of field note. It's very self-reflexive.
Okay.
And then in anthropology, you turn that into a monograph. So, I mean, some of my professors might kill me by simplifying it to this, but I think this is the accessible version.
They won't listen, hopefully.
You turn it into a written monograph.
Okay.
And that written monograph pulls apart the cultural phenomena through the filter of somebody who is trained in the theory and the practice of anthropology.
Okay.
And the problem in that, of course, is like I, as the researcher, we're talking about qualitative things.
Yeah.
I, as the researcher, have a lot of like baggage, personal baggage.
Yeah, I was going to ask. So it's all like coming through your lens.
Yeah, which is kind of like a designer, right?
Yeah.
Right? That's where I'm getting. I'm still figuring it out. Visual anthropology, like most anthropologists, like if the minute you introduce the visual, it gets even way more complicated because the visual became something that as long as I could photograph it, therefore it must be true, right? That if I can take a picture of it, then it's evidence. And there's something very complex about whether I visualize something or I write about something, and it's much easier to be self-reflexive in one form than it is in another.
Mm-hmm.
The methods are the same, but when you move to visual anthropology, you're introducing a microphone, you're introducing a camera, you're introducing a film crew. And then what happens is you start saying, well, what if we actually conduct research and we make a film together? So I don't make a film about you. Instead, let's go the practice of filmmaking actually helps me understand your storytelling method, for example. Mm-hmm. I mean, it can take many different forms. Visual anthropology can also be looking at material culture, the visual material culture. Okay, that's what I thought it can be that as well. It can be that as well. And both of those things are really interesting to me. So if I were to do an ethnography on mica, for example, I would look at, like, okay, what is it about the visual language that is produced here, and what does it say about this as a culture? Okay. What are the hierarchies? What are the what are the social exchanges? What are the priorities or the expectations? What are the rituals? Clearly, there's a Dunkin' Donuts ritual that happens here. There's things that you observe by participating. Yeah. But you also, you can either tell these stories together with what they're called informants, which just sounds kind of a strange thing. Okay. Or you, as you're a part of it, you look at it. Right. So the education goes back and forth, and I draw a lot from these practices, like these methods, and they're very simply participant observation, field work, and field notes. Okay. And how is that any different than, like, okay, if you're working with a client? That was my next question. But if you're working with a client, you go in and you go question. You observe, you walk around, you spend a day, you write notes, and you leave, and you think you understand the thing. And that was always really hard for me. We never have time to spend a year doing that with somebody. But it's the same qualitative understanding of something. And those methods to get at that understanding have to include an understanding of your baggage. So even as a designer, to say, like, I am a lover of Helvetica, and it doesn't matter what they're going to tell me, I'm still going to turn to this little base of, like, typographic pool that this is what I know how to use. And if you can understand that that's your bias, and then you can go back to your client, which would never happen, and say, so I've got these typefaces. Design doesn't have that same, we don't have the space to do that, which is understandable. But I think there's something to be thought about. When I introduce it into the design realm, I think the idea of participant observation is really interesting. I mean, the example, it's like, I'm going to do a project about synchronized swimmers, and I could go and I could watch synchronized swimmers on YouTube, and I'm fine. Yeah. Or I could go and take synchronized swimming classes for a couple months. Oh. Or a couple weeks. And what happens if I actually embody that experience? Will I design it differently? So rather than showing it, I actually have the experience, and I can share the experience. Like, those are some of the ways that when I teach, I say, interesting. This actually was my learning moment at Art Center. I was doing something about gun violence, and the professor said, "Have you ever shot a gun?" I said, "No." And he said, "You need to come back next week with a target practice." And so I went and I shot a gun. Yeah. And that to me was an embodied physical experience that I understood now the power of a gun. And now I can say something about gun control because I actually have a momentary, deeper understanding of something. Right. And I think as designers, we have a tendency to do it with our Google searches. Right. We might understand things with I think it's changing, but it's like with interview, there's a lot of the qualitative research process from social science that's making its way into design. Right. So when you were in these classes and in this program, I'm interested in kind of your design background, how that was finding its way, if at all, into this kind of new field that you were suddenly working in. Yeah, my peers were all making films or making photo series, and
Okay.
I was interested in the relationship between text and
Right.
image.
Of course.
And sometimes, the text I would work with people and they would make the images and
Mm.
they would maybe make the texts, and then
Mm-hmm.
I would think about the way they would come together, or I would write texts and they would make images. Or sometimes it was, it would sort of would play with that.
Yeah.
I think I was very, I think the one thing that my research has continued to follow is museum practice
Okay.
and what happens when the design of an exhibition, like the exhibition format as being the representation of cultural phenomena, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter. It could be at the Jewish Museum. It could be something historical. It could be,
Yeah.
the work that's out in, at a design college. But these become representations of certain cultural
Right.
phenomena.
Right.
And the design is the mediator of the representation.
Yeah.
And it shapes in whatever small way
Yeah.
culture. We know this.
Yeah.
We know
Yeah.
this. But
Yeah.
when you look at it from a kind of more social science, you start to the burden is there. There's a much heavier burden in terms of like what is it that you are reproducing
Mm-hmm.
in terms of stereotypes, or what is the unattended effect of what you're making. Like
Right.
the ethical standpoint around anthropology and ethnography is absolutely like it's at its highest level. So
Yeah.
there's a real burden that's placed on cultural representation,
Right.
and I was really interested in through design. And it's this question again of like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
smoothness and bumpiness, that the bumpiness that Prem Krishnamurti was talking about introduces the reflexivity, that it is a process that is faulty, or it is a process that is a juxtaposition of things that single people are making decisions about, and
Right.
that is problematic.
Mm-hmm.
But it also is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so this podcast is kind of at a high level about design criticism, and it's about how we talk about design. It's also about what we talk about when we talk about graphic design, and what are the things that designers should be thinking about and kind of working through in their process. And so I've talked to a lot of critics and theorists and writers and practitioners kind of about this. Um, and so I'm kind of interested in, from your perspective, how does the work that you're doing and this type of mode of working, how can it kind of change a design practice, or the value of something like this can it bring to a design profession that largely doesn't always think about these things?
I was gonna say we make a lot of crap.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And we make a lot of things that don't necessarily need to be out in the world, but so does every field does it.
Yeah.
It's not specific to design. I think, at least in my education, it's trying to connect when you can, which is much easier in an educational context, that what you're making helps you understand yourself as a designer better.
Mm.
And so that when you go on to make things outside of an educational context or an academic context, that you understand that you are the author of some of these parts, and that there is a somewhat ethical responsibility in terms of what you make.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about the pharmaceutical company or like Milton
Right,
Glazer's
right.
like 10 Steps to Hell.
Right.
It's more about I am a filter, and it's not with like lots of commercial projects.
Yeah.
We're not talking about that, but I think we're talking about we're making this surface thing that can be so seductive, and it can be so, and how many things do we buy that we never read, or how many things do we
Mm-hmm.
The question of like branding, and like things stop meaning things, like the things stop having meaning because they're over branded.
Right.
And what is that actually doing to our language, or to the way we socially interact with each other, or the way that
Right.
we the way that we yeah, it's sort of almost like the way that we move through the world as social human beings. Like
Mm-hmm.
what is design, how is design kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
watering down some of
Yeah.
that. I mean, that's, I guess, I'm not articulating it very well.
No, I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about because something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I completely stole this from the architect Mark Wigley when he curated the Istanbul Design Biennial last year. He had this phrase where he said that the whole this is not his exact language, but the basic idea is that the whole world has been encrusted in a geological layer of design, and that there's no world outside of design anymore, that we can't escape the effects of design. And it's because of that we need to be thinking about these things that you're talking about. And I think that's kind of what I've slowly started to arrive at through these conversations that I've had is that when I'm talking about design criticism, I'm not talking about that surface level. Just what does it look like? Is this logo better than the way it was before, or is this a good color to use for this thing?
Yeah.
But it's that thing below the surface, which is how is this affecting the context in which it now lives, or what was happening in the process of making it, and that seems like it has much more uh, compelling discourse around it than just staying at that surface level.
Just on a material culture level, we are so conditioned by the design. Not even the design that we consume. We are so conditioned, and so then as designers are making more design, I think being really aware of how our taste and our narratives and our even our methods are shaped largely by this design material, this material culture.
Yeah.
And a lot of it points to right now, students want to make the world a better place. Like, can design, social design, what can design do? And quite often the desire is that design will show something rather than. And I think this is the same thing. Like, the documentary, like the National Geographic that goes look, or the BBC special that goes look. I mean, this is talking about sort of cultural representation. Anthropology or visual anthropology looks at these things and says, this is surface.
Right. Yeah.
And actually what needs to happen is it might not look the right way, the way you have learned that, like, cultural documentaries look. It might be messier than that, and it might have real juxtapositions that we can't necessarily sort through. And I think when designers, on one hand, we want to kind of come up with these invisible facilitating markers somehow that make the world a better place. And sometimes I'm thinking, before you can really do that, see if you can understand the thing and make things that somehow struggle. I mean, right now it's the Syrian refugees in Berlin. Everybody wants to work with the Syrian refugees.
Yeah.
But if they don't actually, they don't understand that experience.
Right. Yeah.
We can still make cool icons that will help them navigate a bureaucratic system.
Right.
That's great. But actually, it's not really going to function until somebody gets in there and actually can be that bridge. And it doesn't mean a designer needs to be that bridge, but a designer could really do with bringing people in that can help them bridge those things. There's lots of those kind of really well-meaning kind of way that design wants to help. But without some of that empathetic research that is not knowing what the answer is going to be.
Right.
I mean, we all know this just in, it's like you sort of trust the research process. It's just, I point to a research process that is actually like, we have to suspend what we know, even about typography. Like, I did a project with a group of teenagers from Eastern Europe, from Eastern Germany, from a tiny little town. And the typefaces that they wanted me to use, it was like I am the designer.
Right.
But I actually spent a lot of time trying to understand their design culture.
Yeah.
And trying to understand why they were drawn to these things and what was the pop culture around it and what were they listening to and what was that, that musical genre, how that was attached to these motorcycles that they were driving. I mean, it suddenly kept going and going and going, and then I suddenly had this understanding of what they were consuming was so very different than what I was, my geo-encrusted design layer of my world was so different than theirs, but actually paying close attention to what they, without that value judgment, taught me a lot about where they were in the world at this moment. Yeah. Which, to be a teenager in Eastern Germany is actually, in small town Eastern Germany, is a really tough thing at the moment.
I mean, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and has come up in a lot of the interviews that I've done, is that, like, we kind of need to move away from talking about design as good or not good, or, kind of like classic design versus, outside of kind of classic design, and look at it more in kind of a cultural context like that, and thinking that, maybe things don't look like the Swiss modernists wanted them to look, but does that mean that it's bad design or wrong design if it's kind of, born out of or reflecting the vernacular of a culture that it's going to live in or come out of?
When I was in LA, I studied briefly with Denise Gonzalez-Crisp.
Oh, yeah.
And she said, San Francisco, there's such a learned, like, there's the right and the wrong and the rules of design. And she said, and LA is amazing because it's all so, quote, bad that you are suddenly freed up. And it's sort of like this LA style, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that's always really stayed with me, because it's sort of recognizing how conventional we really are, stuck in a certain history.
Yeah.
And we can go shopping, we can go like, oh, they do that weird stuff over there and that weird vernacular thing, and oh, there's that crazy, I stumbled upon this weird book at the thing, and I can, but that doesn't recognize that vernacular actually exists in a, it has its universe that actually, if you go deeper into it, it actually, you will learn something, and not just borrow or take something.
Oh, right.
Then there's that. I mean, once you go down this path, you won't do any design anymore either.
Yeah.
That's why it's much easier to ask the questions. And, I mean, and I'm starting to feel differently about that. And I'm starting to feel like, actually, I'm ready to make design again. But I think that my role in design will be, it'll be very different. And teaching in Germany is different as well, because I have students from 40, 50 different nations. And so I can't teach a German, like, it's just not appropriate for me to follow. Like, normally it would be like the American education that I had at Art Center, which is already Bauhaus, but then I add sort of Bauhaus to it. See, now I know what Bauhaus is.
Right.
But I actually spend a lot of time where I ask my students from Croatia or from Azerbaijan, like, what's happening there, that we're able to start really looking at design cultures as being like much more juxtaposed, and we can learn from each other.
Right.
I mean, I tend to try to really break that down, but that's because everybody else on the faculty really pushes a German sensibility of design.
Oh, interesting. I have just a couple more questions just to kind of start to wrap everything up, and one of them is kind of what we were just talking about. I'm interested in, you mentioned having an itch or an interest in kind of designing again. And so I'm curious how these last, couple years or I guess 5 or 6 years that you've kind of been in this other world, how has that changed, A, how you think about graphic design, and then B, your own design process, or, if you go kind of back into this, how are you different, or how do you approach it different? How would you approach it differently now?
I think I'm a little bit in a like privileged situation that, like, if I were to be designing again, I think I would do it on a, like, it's almost like a personal level, or it would be with it would be in a context where I am with other people responsible for the content and the writing
Yeah.
and the concept. So, like my own self-publishing kind of
Okay.
context.
Yeah.
That I could sort of see in the right context of people, coming in on a consulting level would be is like super interesting to me, and actually I've had an opportunity to do that on some of it. I think a lot of the design, the way my interest in looking at design again, I mean, I'm always looking at design, but what I tend to really be attracted to are the things that there's like slippages and they sort of bother me because something isn't working right, and then it's like, well, why did this happen? And it's not about like designer books, but it's more looking at well, no, I think there's a lot of sort of contemporary stuff that's coming out there that makes us a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I'm more interested in being uncomfortable in something and seeing people test, sort of the risk taking. Or I like my design to be incredibly invisible and simple, so that I like all this schnick schnack is like a German word. It's like all the little like, it's like get rid of all of it and just let it hold what the content is. There's something, and that's not totally true.
But is that even possible?
No, but it's probably coming through. I've become less tolerant of sort of when design sort of feels superfluous, and it just sort of like when things are getting laid on top, and I want to be
yeah.
And maybe that's because I feel like it's out of a lack of self-awareness of the role of design. If I can feel like what is there is really the bare minimum, like what is it, like if this letter would have been shorter if I'd had more time.
Right, yeah.
That's like if you actually are spending the time and looking at it, and the idea that you pare it down.
Yeah.
Which is kind of going back to, it kind of goes back to, I don't know what it does. It kind of goes back to something that I maybe resisted for a long time. I think I liked these weird experiments where things would happen. I'm not really answering your question.
No, I mean you are. The thing that I kind of thought you were going to go into is I was kind of interested in, and I'm kind of tying this back to one of the very first things that you said actually about kind of when you discovered design in Michigan, and you used this phrase that I really liked of it felt like you were giving your ideas form or something like that. Structure.
It's like it's choreography.
Yeah. And so I thought I was expecting some sort of tie to that of thinking, I feel like now there's this, we've been talking about this kind of very, I don't even know the word, but you're talking about design not in formal ways. And so I was curious how that could manifest itself in the creation of form.
If we were to go back to like sort of the idea of structure and choreography, right?
Yeah.
So really, really quickly, like there is in choreography, there is sort of these fields where it's like the minimal, the everyday, the mundane.
Yeah.
Where it's not about technique and virtuosity. It's really like the Yvonne Rainier and a lot of this Judson Street. It's really about opening and closing hands and real gestural and where I feel like where I was as a dancer 30 years ago or 25 years ago was more technical, and now I'm actually really interested in the like everyday movement that even a non-designer or a non-dancer or a non-observer, finds meaning in, and then finding a structure for that to exist in, but that structure is less choreographed and structured, and it's perhaps just more thoughtful and more present.
Yeah.
That's so abstract, but it sort of makes sense to
me
as
I know
what you
articulating
mean. This.
Yeah.
So I think about bringing people together and creating something that's a little bit improvisational, like, oh, let's, you write, I'll write, we'll all write, and it'll land on this thing, and it'll be meaningful relationship, it'll be meaningful writing, and then we will figure out collectively how to make it into an interesting form.
Right. Right.
Because we're really present, and because it's not.
And that goes back to your original kind of design education and this idea of kind of working through the process and wanting to facilitate things actually in an interesting way.
I don't like I don't like to be by myself. Yeah. Sounding boards, like talking things through like this. This is really helpful.
Oh, good.
It's really interesting.
Good. I have two more questions. Okay. I'm interested in your perspective as a visual anthropologist, as a researcher, as a educator, as someone who leads workshops. What are the issues or topics or subjects in contemporary graphic design that are maybe under theorized or need kind of a spotlight shown on them that kind of contemporary practicing designers should be thinking about and talking about?
It's a really good question. The thing that comes to my mind, I think I go back to this, that the designer, the designer is I say this, there's something about self-reflexivity. Mm-hmm. I feel like students have a hard time owning their position in the process. That they really prioritize it, or they run away from it. And there's something in that in-between thing that says I have to constantly be negotiating who I am in this process.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
And I coming out of the workshop now, the students who make things so personal that you're losing kind of a global, universal sort of understanding, and people who are making it, so that it almost feel like their idea is in another room.
Yeah.
And the inability to articulate that. And both of those situations, it's really about the self. I think that it's not about navel gazing, but it's also not. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know if that feels like it's something that is really hard to get at.
Yeah.
And then actually, a lot of it, I think a lot of it is the younger generation is coming up at a time, where if you can talk about, it's unbelievable to me, sort of these basic things of what's anti-apartheid and what is, sort of there are things that were, now I sound like an old fart, but there are these things that were really important to me. And there's lots of these things that you had to grapple with that were like ethical questions.
Right.
Or that they were fights, and designers sort of had an assumed role in that.
Yeah.
Even in the 90s at Art Center somehow. Maybe superficially in my little crowd. And I think even now with my international students, it's like it has the desire to get that degree and to be able to work. Mm-hmm. Sort of ignores the designer as a cultural producer.
Right.
It's that cultural production.
Right.
And that, all these things are being made. They rush to kind of understand the entrepreneurial or the commercial context, which is needed. I'm not critical of that.
No, I know. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I know I struggle with as a designer, and even as a podcaster, I guess, in thinking about my relationship to my work and those two pillars that you're talking about. I feel like I bounce between them and have a hard time finding that middle ground. And even in this,
I think actually, as we say this, I think it has to do with observation. It has to do with we have to be citizens in the world. We have to go out and do things we're not comfortable doing, and go to things that we don't know anything about, and meet people that are different than us. And now we're back at the anthropologist, who's in sort of like a foreign place. That disjuncture between who I am as a person, or as a creative, or as a designer, or as a whoever I am, or as an American, in the role where I have one hand tied behind my back and I don't really understand everything, and that disorientation teaches one to be everything that teaches one to understand that everything is relevant, the unspectacular, and the the minute, and the and that then you can go back to this practice and just be a little bit more tuned in.
Right.
And I think young people today.
Yeah.
It's in that I think it's observation.
Right.
It's just being tuned in to
it
what's happening.
It comes back to what you're talking about, where research, now I put research in quotes, can be watching a YouTube video, or you can find anything online, and that's different than experiencing it, than doing it, than
it's different than asking people. Like I can look it up, or I can ask people, or I can interview people. But that next level, and I think some of it has to do with discomfort. It has to do with go into situations that are uncomfortable, and you will learn not only something about that thing, you will learn something about yourself.
Yeah.
And so, that's sort of the key, I think, of what I got out of the ethnographic kind of methodology is you have to learn a language, and you don't know the language to go not. Know.
That leads perfectly, actually, into my final question. Thank you. Which, at the risk of being a bit reductive, I'm curious for designers, practitioners who are interested in this way of thinking about design and visual culture. Aside from, just doing that, like what we were talking about, just kind of experiencing those things, where should someone look to kind of start thinking about that? Whether that's kind of books or films or things, like what are good entry points into this way of thinking?
There's some really kind of interesting people, and they've overlapped into the art world. I mean, Hal Foster writes some really nice stuff, and he has the artist and the artist as ethnographer, and he's quite critical of the role of ethnography with art. But I could say designer, I like that text because I can just remove artist and put designer in there, and it has something interesting. Paul Stoller is an American anthropologist who has a text called Sensuous Scholarship.
Okay.
That actually really it was very influential in kind of talking this language about the senses and the sensual, but also the embodiment of we understand things in a large part because of our experience of being there.
Right.
Tim Ingold has this great ways of wayfinding and ways of seeing and ways of knowing and ways of, and he looks at the Inuit, and he looks at all these sort of exotic cultural kind of references, but from a design standpoint, it really in terms of looking at orientation systems and wayfinding, and it's what can we actually borrow that actually helps us understand. That's been influential. There's Jean Rouch. You can go back to the French filmmaker who is the classic. He is the kind of godfather of visual anthropology, and Chronicle of a Summer is a really great film. Chronicle of a Summer. It's in French. And it is extremely experimental. It's quite surreal, but it is the classic film text of visual anthropology.
Interesting.
And it's very provocative, and it's very evocative, and he walks the streets of Paris, and it's the summer of 1960 something. And it's political, and it's nostalgic in quite a beautiful way. But anything that Jean Rouch has written or anything written about him, I think he's extremely influential. Because some of it's highly associative about cultural representation, and I think a lot of it's really relevant to the design. To the design. The making of texts, image, text, language. Sarah Pink is a British writer who writes a lot about it, and she's doing visual ethnography, and she's actually one of the only people who's really writing about the role of wall texts to this image that you make, or the role of, she kind of starts to pull design, but actually there's very little written. That's what I think is interesting. Design, like visual anthropology, doesn't really look at design, and design really only borrows from ethnography when you are like at IDEO and you need to understand.
Right.
Like Starbucks hires a visual anthropologist to like figure out, how does the Starbucks culture in Paris want their coffees delivered. Like, that tends to be the role of ethnography in design at the moment.
Right. This has been so great for me.
I'm so glad. I was very uncertain if I could speak to design criticism.
No, I feel like this was so interesting to me on multiple levels and has me thinking about a lot of things that I had not thought about in this specific way before, and I feel like you've helped me make some connections that I hadn't made before. So thank you so much for this conversation. This was welcome. So interesting.
This would be called also like elicitation. Like, you have totally gotten me to think through things.
Oh,
just
good.
By sticking this big microphone in the room, it like made me say things that I wouldn't have normally said.
This episode was recorded on April 15th, 2017 in Baltimore, Maryland. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.